Well, a very warm welcome to everyone who's with us, St. Thomas Church, Fifth Avenue. So glad you're here today, and we're here with a special guest. Thank you, David, for joining us. You're a lecturer. I'd like to introduce Dr. David Mahan, a lecturer in religion and literature at Yale. Thank you for coming at Yale Divinity School. Are you coming from New Haven?
Yes.
This weekend? Thank you so very much. Let me let someone in. You're at YDS and you're executive director, a place in my mind close to my heart, the Rivendell Institute at Yale. I presume, is that an allusion to Tolkien?
Yes.
Wonderful. And co-director of the Rivendell Center for Theology and Witness. He has also had, as he says, the great privilege of teaching our current associate priest for pastoral care, Mark Schultz. When one of the brightest students you say you've ever had.
Yes.
And so we agree. And you and your wife Karen have 3 adult children, and you live in Hampton with your dog and 2 cats.
Yes.
And we're so very grateful for you to join us this morning on Christ the King Sunday to speak about poetry as a way of attentiveness. So without further ado, welcome. Please welcome him here. And I'll be in the other room.
Thank you, Matthew, and good morning, all of you. I'm sorry I have to stand behind the podium, but in order to do the online thing, I have to stay back here as well. It is a pleasure to be with you, and just to reiterate, Mark indeed was one of the brightest students that I've ever had, and you should talk with him sometime about literature because it's some of the richest conversations I ever have. So. Mark, thank you for facilitating this opportunity.
Sure, I'm gonna, oh, you're already sharing.
Yes.
I think you are.
Yep.
Are you?
Yes.
Yes, you are. Okay.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah, it looks good here.
Perfect.
All set on that. So poetry as a way of attentiveness. My theme, I actually did this at another church whose theme for the class was attentiveness, and hence the title of this talk. But I thought, that is really a good way of approaching the study of poetry, and certainly captures some of the ambition that I have for the classes that I teach in religion and literature at Yale Divinity School. And goodness knows we are in a place in our culture where paying attention is perhaps one of our greatest challenges. Not only are we distracted people, but we seem often at sea in regard to what it is we need to pay attention to. So being attentive or mindful, as we now say, I think is integral to our well-being. As the novelist Jose Ortega y Gasset once wrote, "Tell me what you pay attention to, and I will tell you who you are." The poet Denise Levertov once wrote that poems can manifest, quote, an ecstasy of attention, a passion for the thing known. And that thing may be any object or person or experience. It may also be God. So when reading poetry, not only are our minds and our senses engaged in ways that concentrate our focus on the poem's subject, but in this way, our emotions are also stirred, creating keen interest in and connection with that subject. And I should just pause and ask, are any of you readers of poetry? Okay, all of you are, good. Well, this will reiterate some of what you already experienced. So here's my main point before turning to the work that I want to do together and reading a couple of poems. Poems require us to pay attention, and in the process, they repay training in attentiveness. So paying attention to their subject, but also paying attention to their form. And so the paying attention to the subject, I often compare to a prism. And it's as if a poem will take a subject and turn the prism and refract new facets of the subject or new ways of looking at the subject that we hadn't noticed previously. But paying attention to poetic form means paying attention to language. Poetry as a way of attentiveness can apprentice us in what one theologian called the long discipline in learning how to speak. So thinking about our own cultural moment again, learning how to speak, speaking as a discipline certainly seems appropriate to our own social moment. So when we read poems, we not only ask, what is this poem about? But what does it mean? We ask, what is this poem doing? how does a poem's form make meaning with and through words? And to get at that, let me just show you one example of a poem by one of my former students, also from the Yale Divinity School, Leah Sylvaeus. Is an Asian American poet, just published her first collection of poetry called Arabilis. And this is one of the poems from that. This is the prose version. So these are the words of the poem. I'm not going to read it, I'm just going to have you look at it. This is what Leah does with the words. So if you set these two side by side, what are some of the things that you notice? What are some of the things that impress you about what Leah has done with the words?
Oh, she's changed the breath.
Yeah, yeah. Talk about that. In what sense?
Breathe in, you take in energy, and breathe out or let out energy. The energy you let out is related to the material of the thought.
Yeah. So even looking at the last three lines, all of that white space is asking us to pause, asking us to emphasize, cloy me, mote me, rise me up. So it is controlling our breath simply by virtue of the form. And that control of our breath that the poem engineers is what creates an atmosphere for the subject. What else do you notice?
We have a question from Isabel online.
Yeah,
Can you
Isabel,
unmute
go
yourself?
for it.
Oh, thank you. I think that point about the white space is really interesting. I was thinking similarly about the enjambments on the line in the poem written on the recto of the page, especially the one that ends with the M dash, but desire not beauty of the table, but what drags us starving there. And then we have to kind of change our, like, go back to the left side of the page to read it. And in that moment, it's like, I want to know what's there. I think it's a really good way to draw out kind of that attentiveness.
Yeah. And even that line, what was buried there, or what was buried inside, located right in the middle of that line, literally puts it inside that space as well. Yeah, that's a great observation. Notice too, and related to the enjambment, but also the structure of the lines, how the end of the lines brings emphasis. And so in the second strophe there, each night I pray resurrection, and resurrection hangs out at the end of the line. But then it's brought back into but am deceived, and then followed by faith is not feast. It's a standalone line, but it enjambs with but desire. Any other observations about what Leah has done formally and the effect of it? This line, not beauty of the table, but what drags us starving there. I encourage you to think about that when you go to Eucharist today. What is the condition under which we approach the Lord's table? Drags us starving there. So there's a method that I use with my students. I just want to show you this briefly, and then we're going to have a chance to do it together. It's what I call reading poems in their own terms. This is a bit artificial. You can't really break up a poem into these three emphases, but it's a heuristic device that helps us to get at some of the sense of the poem. So I imagine this. Think about a poem, first of all, as the creation of a world. It has a setting, it has a speaker, it has a point of view. We are being asked to focus our attention on something. And the speaker of the poem is the person who is directing our attention in particular ways. And as we just saw, the form of the poem is also directing us. So what is the world that the poem conjures for us? And then the world of the text has to do with how the poem is built. How is this poem structured? How is it created? What images does it use? What word choices do we find in the poem that create all of the effect and generate the meaning that the poem has? And so it asks us to pay attention to those kinds of formal details. And then the world in front of or beyond the text is what sort of vision does the poem project? A vision of ourselves, a vision of our existence, a vision of God, whatever may leave the page, so to speak, that this poem prompts in us. And I love this comment by Paul Ricoeur about the intersection of the world of the text with the world of the reader. How does this poem register with me a new way of seeing or perceiving? How does it challenge my perceptions? How does it challenge me to think differently about the subject? Does it ask anything of me? I'm always interested when I study poems with my students with the question, what are the stakes for me as a reader? Where does this poem lead me? To think about what? To change my what? To respond in action with what? Etc. So that's the world beyond the text. Again, it's somewhat artificial because actually all of these things are happening at the same time when you're reading a poem. This just helps us to pay attention to some of the formal details of it as we work our way through the poem. And so I want to practice this with the first poem that you have on your sheet, with the poem Kneeling by R.S. Thomas, one of my favorite poems that I use in a class called Reading Poetry Theologically. This is a poem whose subject is about attentiveness, but also is structured in order to create attention on the part of the reader. Let me read the poem, and then I'm going to have us discuss this in small groups, two facets of this this process of reading poems in their own terms. I'm actually going to have you create two small groups. We'll get to that momentarily, but let me read it first. Do you know, by the way, who R.S. Thomas is? Have you read any of his poetry? So Thomas was a Welsh priest in the Anglican Church of Wales. His parishes were usually very small parishes. Part of a declining membership of these churches, often very few parishioners even showed up for services. And so this was a very familiar moment to the priest poet R.S. Thomas. Kneeling. Moments of great calm, kneeling before an altar of wood in a stone church in summer, waiting for the God to speak. The air a staircase for silence, the sun's light bringing me as though I acted a great role. And the audience is still. All that close throng of spirits waiting, as I, for the message. Prompt me, God, but not yet. When I speak, though it be you who speak through me, something is lost. The meaning is in the waiting. So there's what I'd like us to do. We're just going to do the first two, the world in the text and the world of the text. And online, Matthew is going to facilitate a discussion of both simultaneously. So if you could form two small groups, those of you who are present here, so you can see each other. I apologize, you're going to have to turn your chairs around a little bit.
All right, so I'm going to mute you. And you're going to turn me off. Great. All right. Can you hear me? Great. Well, let's begin. Wait, can you hear me in the other room? Oh, I don't want that. Okay. But if you turn the, one second. Sorry, everybody. It seems that I can't talk without everybody in the room hearing. So we're just gonna have to wait. Maybe we could chat about it on the.
We can even chat in the chat feature, don't you think?
Let's do it. Well, let's chat. you will have to unmute yourself manually. There,
Yes, I am unmuted.
great.
All right. So people online can chime in as well, but let's think about this world in the text. Where are we? The scene, the setting, who is speaking? What do we learn about the speaker? What were some of the conclusions that you reached about that?
We're in a stone church in the summer in the daytime because the sun is out.
Okay. Is this perhaps the time of the morning service, or what else do you think about that? The world conjured by the poem, this setting.
So we have, then we had like some different like ideas about when this could be taking place. Like it wasn't totally clear if this was like a moment of solitary prayer. And like the audiences referred solely to like spiritual audiences of like God and the heavenly hosts. Or if this was like the moment before the Eucharist, or if this was like the moment before a sermon.
Yeah.
Right, it seemed like there were a couple different ones.
Yeah. It's not entirely clear. Given that Thomas was a priest, you might imagine there was that his great role involved something liturgical at that moment. Oftentimes priests will pray before they deliver the homily as well, so it may have been that. Anything else about the world in the text, the scene?
Like it's lingering in the moment of ambiguity before sermon is delivered, before full inspiration takes over, and sort of acting in that moment of uncertainty. So let's make that attention, not dead being inspired or whatever.
Yeah, and so there's a time signature that is announced at the very beginning of the poem, moments. This is sort of a moment of pause as well. So yeah, terrific. Anything from people online about the world in the text? I don't know why I'm looking there. I should be looking here. Okay, how about the world of the text? What were some of the things that you all observed and the effect of how the poem is built and creating meaning around this subject?
Well, it's a drama.
Mean to put you on the spot, but Isabel, you had some great points.
Thank you. Yeah, I was interested in kind of the juxtaposition between the like materiality of the church and the altar being made of wood and stone versus of the other kind of settings. So like the staircase made of air and the sun and how they relate to each other in the third section. So like in front of or beyond the text.
Yeah, that's something that I hadn't noticed before, how there's that kind of interaction. There's something that wants to root this poem very much in the concrete, in the material reality of the world. And yet there's this lift. We'll come back to beyond the text presently here, but sorry, what were you, you said theater.
There's a drama ending.
Yeah.
He says, though I acted a great role, and he uses a word from the theater to prompt me. Because in the theater, there are prompts. Outside.
Yeah.
They can give you the words if you can't remember.
Yeah. And so the speaker is very much in the center of attention in his own mind as he is about to do whatever it is that he is going to do, deliver a sermon or the Eucharist or whatever. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it seems like he's on the precipice, like he's waiting for whatever is going to inspire him. And, in the poem it says, waiting for the God to speak. All that closest throughout experience waiting, and then ending with the meaning is in the waiting. So in this moment of calm, it's like something big is going to happen once that moment is over, because he's presumably going to be speaking.
Yeah.
And so this is the intensity of that moment, but it's also very quiet and still. So.
Yeah, and there's a change with that, the indented line, the indented space prompt me. As if, and you were coming on this earlier, as if the speaker took a breath and suddenly his attention was changing, about to move into whatever that action is going to be. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think the last line is ironic because he's waiting to be prompted. And then you realize, wait a minute,
Yeah.
the important thing already happened.
Yeah, so
It's the
let's,
silence that's the important thing.
yeah,
So
let's talk
waiting,
about
It's
this.
the being there
Yeah.
and being available, that's the.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. And this relates to the world beyond or in front of the text, whatever we call it, is, and that's where we are left. And so, we're given this odd kind of declaration. The meaning is in the waiting. What else do you make of that? In terms of not only what the point that the poem seems to want to drive home, but where it leaves us. Other thoughts about it?
Seems to me like there's sort of an irony, because you would think you would go to hear the priest be divinely inspired and speaking from like the authority of God, that he was saying means in the period before he's really divinely inspired to speaking in human fashion, or like kind of more humble.
In line with this theater connection, it's as if the main act has already happened. And what follows is not the main act. Now think about religious observance, religious practices, whether you're lay people or clergy, whatever, it's about the performance. But this speaker says, actually, the meaning is found in something otherwise. This doesn't mean that what this speaker is about to do is irrelevant or insignificant. It's just not everything. It's not really where the meaning is found. So any other thoughts about that? Yeah, go ahead.
Jacob's ladder imagery from the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And so this idea of ascending to God, like in silence or spiritually, and although it is important, like that we like through like the liturgy or like sermons, like bring that to the physical world, that there is something like transcendental that is lost by trying to like materialize it.
Yeah. And yet the material is where we live. As was pointed out earlier. Yeah, Mark.
It's that with the empty staircase, the empty ladder, the space between message and prompts, all of the waiting, and that beautiful application of a bell, that and the space in the bell, the sunlight, which is intangible, immaterial, but that is the thing that's doing the ringing, and then the sound itself being sort of intangible, but nonetheless, there's it all makes me think about the old notion that what is useful about the vase is the empty space in it. It allows it to hold something. What's useful about so much is the emptiness that it holds that can be filled, as opposed to the thing itself.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't want to go all Eastern on you, but the meaning is in the non-doing.
Yeah.
It's just being there. Like Mary and Martha.
Yeah.
One is sitting, one is very busy.
Yeah, I mean, even when you think about the climax of a service, a worship service, and it is about doing, and it is a kind of theater. I think it's a sincere and important performance. But what we expect, where we expect to find the meaningfulness of that moment. So this poem wants to say, actually, it's if it finally leads to silence, and that's where this poem finally leads, is to a silence of its own. Yeah,
There's Isabel online.
Yeah, go for it.
Oh, sure, thanks. I think that's a really interesting point, because like with the last line or the last two lines, through me something is lost, the meaning is in the waiting. It kind of reminds me of like the meaning maybe being like trust in God, that he will like deliver, either divine inspiration for the sermon or just his presence, which I thought was interesting because of the one line that's kind of stuck out, the request, prompt me, God. Like we're in this moment of like anticipation to hear from God, and then the end just kind of confirms that to me. Like the meaning is like, the point is that he's going to respond, like he's there. I don't know, that just stuck out to me.
Yeah, I mean, we could almost substitute that the faith is in the waiting. There is an act of, if waiting is an action at all, it's an act of trust as well, that something is available. In this case, the voice of God, the presence of God is available. So, Okay, let's move on to the next poem. This is an interesting poem by the poet Mary Shebist. Hitting my slide is not advancing.
If it's useful.
Oh, here we
There
go.
it is.
Here we go. I needed to put the cursor on that. So Mary Shebist wrote a book, a collection called Incarnadine, which is a series of meditations on the Virgin Mary and specifically on the Annunciation. And as she says in her comments about the book, which won the National Book Award in 2013, so it achieved a certain prominence. She says, I wanted to take the iconography of the Annunciation out of the realm of symbol, where its meaning is predetermined, and into the realm of contemplation, a realm with room for doubt, investigation, imagination, play. And this is one of the examples of her attempting that kind of contemplation. I'd like you to read it to yourself first. Now we know where this is from. This is a found poem. We look at the text from which it is drawn. Mary visited Yale and I asked her, how did you create this poem? She said, I literally went to the text and started to bang out words from the text until I was left with Annunciation under oration. A couple of interesting ways that this poem works. One is that what it requires of us in order to read it. So I'd like two of you to give it a shot. Read it however you think it wants to be read. Can I get two volunteers to do that? There's one. There's another. Okay, go ahead. Give it a shot. How would you read this? There's not a correct reading, by the way. I think that's part of the point of the poem, but go ahead and give it a shot.
And he came to her and said, the Lord is troubled in mind. Be afraid, Mary. The Holy will overshadow you. Therefore be nothing. Be impossible. And Mary said, and the angel departed from her.
Thank you. Your version.
And he came to her and said, Lord is troubled in mind. Be afraid, Mary. The Holy will overshadow you. Therefore, be nothing. Be possible. And Mary said, angel departed.
Neither one of those readings is accurate or more accurate. They both are legitimate. So the point is that how we actually read the poem itself is engineered by the way that the poem is structured, and it creates a variation, a range of possibilities, which means that she is working this vein of the range of possibilities that might emerge from the Annunciation itself. If you understand what I mean there. So how it interacts with and illuminates the original almost functions like a form of biblical commentary. And such that we have before us both the scene of the Annunciation and also the scene of reading and writing. It presses us into the role of being attentive interpreters, not above or apart from the original, but within it. We are situated within the account itself, within the text and the story that the gospel reports. So what is so familiar to us as a symbol, as a moment that we read the account of every year, not too long from now, suddenly becomes strange again. And it's that strangeness that refreshes our own dynamic contemplation. As Shivas explains, locating us in a realm with room for doubt, investigation, imagination, play. So something that is wholly familiar to us, almost something we hear if you participate in worship in the liturgical calendar. This is read every year, like so many of those classic passages from the Bible. This poem, even its very structure, is creating the possibility of a refreshed reading by placing us within the text itself. We don't have time to go into a lot of the details, but tell me some of what you think the work is that this poem does in terms of refreshing other ways of reading the Annunciation. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, it says, on the left, do not be afraid, Mary, right? And that's language we all are familiar with. And she just took be afraid, Mary.
Yes.
To me, that was interesting. That stopped me because I thought, wow, that's just really changing what I'm used to hearing when I get to this passage.
Yeah, and what does it cause you to think about? Again, given that it's the exact opposite of what we find in the original.
It actually stopped me in my tracks and made me more aware or alert in reading. It made me more attentive.
Yeah. Well, and imagine this young woman, Mary, being approached by an angel who suddenly appears in a room and is announcing these remarkable things that are going to happen to her. This was a fearful moment, undoubtedly. One that in the gospel account, Mary responded to with remarkable faith, but this was fearful. And so, again, making us imagine, what was it like for Mary? Be afraid, Mary. Was Mary afraid? Would you be afraid if you had a visitation of this sort of thing? You see how it is opening up other ways of thinking about this text. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to build on that. So I think that the whole first half of the poem actually kind of like allows us to like reverse how we typically consider the Annunciation, right? Like, so it starts with the Lord is troubled in mind, if you choose to read it that way, which is an interesting way of thinking, like, because like God is troubled by the state of humanity, he has chosen to send his son to redeem the world.
Yeah, this opening on to another angle on God's motivation. What is it that would be troubling God, that would motivate God to visit this young woman and declare this birth that she was going to get? Yeah.
Came to her and said, the Lord is. And then I went to Mary, but she's troubled in mind. And she's
Okay, yeah.
Mary, you need to herself. You need to be afraid, or you are afraid. That's why I read that.
Yeah. Again, you can't tie the meaning up in a neat bow. It's the point is that the very structure of the poem is radiating different possibilities, which don't subvert the original or discard the original, but open it up. Again, with the effect that we suddenly become attentive readers and contemplators of this moment that may be so familiar to us, we don't really think about it much anymore. So just one more comment and then we need to wrap up here.
Yeah, it's just, thinking especially if the title to Annunciation under erasure. And I think that it's speaking a lot to the fact that Mary is like the star of the show here in the Annunciation is the fact that now Jesus will be born and Mary becomes pregnant with Jesus. And that's the important part of the Annunciation. And but really what's being erased there is Mary herself.
Yeah.
And so it says that directly in the poem, the holy will overshadow you, and that's, for me, at least when I read the poem, I think that's why Mary should be afraid. It's going to become much more than Mary.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so the question that arises from the very title of the poem is who or what does end up under erasure? I actually wrote an article on this that included this poem as well, and I argue at the end that although we don't have the words of Mary responding to this, the last agency in the poem is Mary. And Mary said, and the angel leaves. So Mary does take the stage. What is she going to say? How is she going to respond to this? And so I do think there's a way that Mary is recovered, but it's only going through this reconsideration of what it might have been like for her to be confronted with this. Yeah, last comment, and then I'm going to wrap us here.
Well, obviously a lot has been erased and a lot of the meaning has been lost through the erasures. You can read pretty much the whole of the poem as a grammatically correct, right?
Yeah.
Aside from the and Mary said, right? Like if you just present that, you know the story of the Annunciation, you present the rest of it in plain prose, right? It would be a grammatically correct set. It could done. If it said those things, then it could leave. Right? But the end Mary said makes it obvious that it's down.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that's how you read it too, which is a perfectly legitimate way of reading it, because the enjam line suggested that and do bring us to that moment. And then it's empty space after that. Yes, thank you for that. So I mean, this is a very small taste of the kind of work that we can do with poetry and the consideration of the kind of theological work that poetry can do. In my classes, as Mark knows, we would spend 2 hours and maybe look at 3 poems over the course of that. We've spent about 20 minutes looking at 2 poems. So just a taste of it. But one of the things that I would leave you with in thinking about this question, what kind of theological work does poetry do? We're used to reading other ways of doing theology. And my suggestion is this is a way of doing it that asks us to reimagine what it is that we believe. Even some of the original texts of our faith, as this poem by Shivas does. And so one of the important elements, I think, in reading poetry, literature, other arts is what I call equipping the imagination. We need to have our imaginations equipped in order to reimagine in responsible and invested ways what it is that we believe. And I think we live in a society where the same sort of action has to take place. How can we help others around us reimagine? How can we equip their imagination? And my suggestion is that poetry, literature, the arts is one of the most important things that church people can be invested in today. So as I sometimes say, art is a way of seeing that enables us to see more clearly, more perceptively, more sensitively, more attentively. So thank you for your attention and have a blessed rest of the Sunday.
Thank you, Doctor, for joining us. We're so very glad you did a part of this morning, and the morning continues. I'm going to make sure we're turning off the recording. So keep going.
I'll let you end all of that.
Yes. And we will not be having a class next week because of the Thanksgiving holiday, but by next week, we will have with us Father Luigi Gioia, who will be our associate for for Christian formation. Oh man, it's like Gandalf coming over the ridge. Oh man. So we're very glad he'll be here to lead our theology class in the future. So every blessing. Goodbye.
Thank you.